Mr. Bradlee and Mr. Woodward were visiting with our other guests in the overflow area in the theater. My name is Tim Naftali. I'm director of the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum. On behalf of the National Archives, I want to welcome all of you tonight. Thank you. And now, please join me in welcoming Mr. Ben Bradlee and Mr. Bob Woodward. We are going to have a conversation tonight. Before we begin, I first of all thought I would introduce people who don't need an introduction. Tell you something about them you might not know. Mr. Bradlee, although he doesn't look it, is a World War II veteran. He served. Do that again. He served in the Pacific Theater on the USS Essex. It's important to keep Philip. It's important to keep in mind he was in the Navy. That connection will matter in a moment. Mr. Bradlee covered the 1960 campaign. He worked for Newsweek. He got to know a young senator named John F. Kennedy. Produced one of the more interesting books about President Kennedy called Conversations with Kennedy. Then found his way to the Washington Post, and you're going to hear a lot more about that soon. And found himself in a position of authority and importance during two key moments in the history of the Post, both of which we'll talk about tonight. One, of course, is the Pentagon Papers story, and the other is Watergate. We are truly, truly fortunate to have such a pioneer, legendary figure of American journalism. The man next to him worked for a small newspaper in Maryland very hard after having spent 5 years in the Navy. During part of that time, he was in a non-combat role, but he was off the coast of Vietnam. Bob Woodward has written 16 books, and you've made 12 of them New York Times #1 bestsellers.
Think of that.
Bob, I interviewed both of these gentlemen for the library, and Bob Woodward was very keen to come and visit. And I cannot tell you how delighted I am to see how keen you all are to see him and Mr. Bradlee. It's great. Ben?
Sir.
It's June 1972. And you've got these two young guys covering a crime story. How is it that the Post put a Mr. Bernstein and a Mr. Woodward together to cover a break-in?
Well, it was a total accident. A. B, the assignment was not made by me because I was not working that day. That was a Saturday. I mean, I can't take credit. I hope I'll get enough credit before the evening's out, but I can't get credit for that. When the deputy managing editor, no, one even that, it was the third or fourth deputy got down, assigned, it came time to assign the story. It was on a Saturday. I was not working.
It was one of the greatest days in June ever in Washington, D.C. You weren't working. Most of the people who mattered weren't working.
not apologizing for that. I hope to get a lot of credit before the night's through, but I don't want any credit for that.
But the city editor looked around and there was this strange burglary and said, "It's so nice out. Who would be dumb enough to come to work on a day like this?" And immediately my name sprung to his mind. And I got called in.
Why were you dumb enough to come to work that day?
Well, because...
Money.
No. Curiosity, and it was truly, as we now look back on it, the golden age of newspapering. Ben Bradlee was already a legend, and you wanted to work for him, and it was an atmosphere in which there were no stops. There was a sense of you can go and do anything. The day I started working for the Washington Post, the city editor took me out to lunch and said, "You have an unlimited expense account. You can take anyone out. You can go to the jockey club every day, but make sure you get good stories."
We did say that.
Well,
I don't know what he used for money, but...
but if we can take you back, Ben, when did this crime story begin to matter for you? This one that you were away enjoying the day.
Well, I think it was a Saturday. I've forgotten. But the next day that I came to work, and I was quite well known for working a lot, I saw who'd gotten the story, Woodward and Bernstein, two guys that I didn't know very well. We had tried to hire Bob once, and we had no place. Can you believe that? And sent him out to Prince George's County, one of the counties around.
Montgomery County.
Montgomery County, and said, come back in a year. And Dan, if he didn't, to the day. And, which is not unlike Woodward. And we had a slot open at that time and hired him. And Bernstein was a kind of a different cat altogether. Had worked for the Evening Star, which was the evening paper in Washington. And we had hired him because he had shown, I thought, a special talent for writing. I was more interested in his writing than his reporting, and we were more interested in this guy's reporting than his writing. Not that either was bad at the other. They were both good at the other.
And we got your attention with the story when we did the $25,000 Dahlberg check story. And here was a check that had been given to the Nixon campaign. It had gone to Maurice Stans, who was the chief fundraiser, and somehow it wound up in the bank account of one of the Watergate burglars. That was hard to explain.
You're always interested in money in these stories, you know. Who got the money? And to have a $25,000 check show up in a Miami bank, deposited by some guy who had no, what the hell was his name?
Bernard Barker.
Yeah,
one
who
of the
had no,
burglars.
I never heard of him before. And it was just, everything came together. And we had the two white guys waiting, and by God, there it was. Just grew from there. 400 stories in the next 2.5 years. That's a lot of stories. In newspapers, you know, we were famous for abandoning stories that, no women, no sex, no nothing. They're out of there in 3 weeks.
Do you think your experience with the Pentagon Papers publication shaped how you dealt with their story?
Well, there's no question about it. And some of you probably don't know about the Pentagon Papers, but the Pentagon Papers was a story that the Washington Post was beaten on. The New York Times had uncovered this grand study of what was going on in the Pentagon, and it was a devastating indictment of American government, and we didn't have it. But when we got it, we went to work on it, and that formed a confidence in ourselves, I think, and especially in Katharine Graham, who was the owner of the Post. Her husband was actually the owner, but he was a manic depressive and in a state where he was not often around, and so that's how we got it. And then you know, we even though we were second on the story, we did very well, and we started breaking stories.
And the significance was that you were publishing with the government saying, don't you dare publish, and actually going to the Supreme Court and saying, we the government have a claim that this should not be published.
Top secret, blah, 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 you
national
know.
Security.
National security is involved, as if some of us didn't know a little about national security, having spent 4 years in the war, and I had a lot of top secret clearances at that time.
The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the press, and what that did is said in stone, final ruling, that there's no pre-publication censorship. There's no ability the government has. They do not have the power to come in and stop newspapers from publishing.
They can't tell you to not write something before you do it.
They can come after you.
They can put you in the slammer afterwards.
Bob, now I'd like you to take us to the courtroom. Recount for us that moment, I think also captured in the film. When you're in the courtroom, what do you hear in the courtroom?
Well, what's interesting, on this wonderful Saturday, they sent me down to the routine arraignment hearing of the 5 burglars. Now, these were not your average DC burglars. They were all had suits, $100 bills in their pocket, very sophisticated electronic equipment, and so it was a mystery. And the 5 guys are paraded in, and the judge starts asking them what they did. And the lead burglar, who was named James McCord, when asked, went, and the judge said, "Speak up, Mr. McCord," and he went, CIA. And he said, "Speak up." And he finally said, CIA. Now, those are electric words. And that...
And I knew one of the burglars. Believe it or not, I knew him. And how the hell, the Italian guy.
You never told us that.
Oh, I did too.
What was his name? Fiorini?
Gonzalez.
What?
Gonzalez?
No, the Italian. Frank Fiorini.
Frank
Fiorini.
Frank Fiorini. How the hell I knew him, I don't know. But I did.
Oh, no, you can't say that.
Okay, yeah.
We're going to let that, okay, no.
Yeah.
So,
But so that gave a momentum to the story. How is it that the lead burglar, who was head of security at the CIA and head of security for the Nixon re-election committee, was involved in this? And then Carl and I wrote subsequent stories on it, and there was, I mean, you look back on it, and it seems like the trail is obvious. But at the time, it was not clear. And the big break in the next couple of days was the simple entry in the address books of 2 of the burglars. Gene Bashinsky, one of the real bedrock police reporters, got this information from his police sources, and the entry
Who seized
simply
it from the burglar.
from the burglars, took all of their, everything in their pockets, and it said Howard Hunt -W House. And of course,
yeah.
What do you want?
Carl Bernstein, who had much more imagination than I, when he said, Howard Hunt dash W House. W House could only be one of two things. And so he called the whorehouse and I called the White House. And it was a time when you could get through, and Howard Hunt got on the phone. And I said, Mr. Hunt, how come your name is in the address books of two of these burglars? We didn't call it the Watergate in the Democratic headquarters then. And he paused and said, "Good God!" Slammed down the phone. And left.
We knew he had it.
Yes.
There was a certain "I am packing my bags" quality to his voice. It's like CIA. It got your attention, and now on your exhibit here, you see that Haldeman and Nixon that day or the next day are talking about Howard Hunt. As Haldeman said, he disappeared. We've disappeared him, and we can undisappear him. So, again, there is that.
Is this your fault?
Pardon?
It was your fault. Did your senior colleagues at the Post show any jealousy as these stories were starting, or did they actually do the opposite?
I'll answer that.
Yeah, go ahead.
They ignored the story for 1 day or 2 days, and as it grew, they started shuffling, as only a senior reporter who was being lapped by a junior reporter could shuffle, and sort of started whispering to me that didn't I think it was about time that they took over the story, and which I mean, no credit to me. These guys had the goods, and they were delivering the goods, and why the hell would I go to some big shot just because he was an expert in Vietnam or some foreign affairs thing? And so we never gave it a thought, and that was the beginning of it all.
But it is
a great friendship to boot.
Yeah, but if you look back on it, it is rather amazing that you let us stay on the story.
Well, I always thought so, but
Now,
he doesn't mention it a lot.
did you let them go with every story that they wanted to go with?
What?
Did you stop a few stories? Did you tell them not to do a few stories, or did you let them go?
No, the way the system works is that once the first story or the first two stories are in and they hold up, and nobody is suing you, and nobody is saying, what the hell are you doing? I do, just let them go. And they knew the story. But they found a check. That's the big thing. It was a check for $25,000.
But the interesting thing is
With
there
the
were
payoff
times
checks.
There were times when you would look at, we wrote stories on things called typewriters. You remember what those are? And there would be 6-ply paper where you would have an original,
They don't know what
5
that is.
copies.
Carbon bit between each of 6.
Right. And
Took an hour to
Bradlee
thread
would get a carbon copy, and the other editors, and you would look at it, and very frequently you would say, I want to know more about this. Hold this story. And you held us back, and this is now your chance to apologize. No, but I've often said this
With
without
results.
you in the room, but let me say it. You were a great editor, not just because of what you published, but what you didn't publish. And you never said, we're not going to run this story ever. You said, I'm not yet convinced. We need more information. We need more sources. We need more details. And so, we would then, kind of curse you and say, Bradlee, he thinks he knows everything. And then we'd go to work. And the sources and information were available, and you were always willing to say, okay, now the story is ready. And that limiting role of an editor, I mean, it's so relevant now in journalism where there are nobody says no, in a sense. Everything gets published. Anyone can say anything about anyone now. And I look back on it and I cherish those moments when you said, not yet.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's very nice.
Tell us a little bit about the source that most people know about. Tell us about when Mark Felt Deep Throat becomes important to your reporting, please.
But he becomes very important in the first days when we had this Howard Hunt, who was a consultant who worked in the White House for Chuck Colson, who was really one Nixon's special counsel and his hatchet man to a certain extent. And so the connection between Hunt and Colson was really important. But I can have your name in my address book, and if then I'm arrested for burglary or something, doesn't mean you put me up to it. And I called Mark Felt, who was not identified to anyone at the Post at that point, and said, and it turns out he was really the guy getting all the Watergate information from the Washington field office. And I said, what's this Hunt connection? And he said, in a very important way, because I was worried, is this a linkage without substance? And he said, don't worry, you cannot say something unkind about Howard Hunt or Chuck Colson that doesn't have merit. And that was very important, because as we now go back and construct the FBI investigation, they had established Hunt's role. In fact, he was not one of the burglars, but he was outside that night and so forth, and was the operational director of this burglary team. So Mark Felt becomes important right away.
But you don't tell Mr. Bradlee about Mark Felt. You just tell him what?
That there's a senior source in the Justice Department who is verifying details we're getting elsewhere.
Was it?
That surprises me about me. I mean, I wouldn't, I've never done it again, but it was so hard to quibble with success. He was right. And there was a check, always if there's money involved. And the money shows up, and it's what you had heard it was going to be, and it was where it should be. You know you've got a tiger by the tail. And why not leave well enough alone? That's what I said. I wouldn't do it again. I'll tell you that.
I was going to say, was it unusual for you to have a reporter come to you with a major story and say, I can't tell you the source of the story, but I trust this source?
Well, yes, it was unusual, but not unheard of to say that I've got a source. And, in the beginning, who gives a damn about who the source is so long as he's right? Gotta be right. And as this, I don't think, how many corrections did we run? And we ran one, and the whole time we had some, and that was idiotic. We said that something had happened in front of a grand jury, and it hadn't taken it to the grand jury. It was in front of the United States Attorney. It was substantially right, but technically.
But in a story that's moving fast like that, if you'd taken me aside, as you know, ever called me into your office and said, I need to know who this source is, of course I would have told you. And it was, and this was the dumb luck factor in all of this, we always had multiple sources. We always had something as you say, a check or a secret fund, who controls these disbursements, or dirty tricks or sabotage, and getting it from people mostly in the Nixon committee or investigators. And so there was never a moment where I guess you felt, gee, I need to know who.
Well, I knew he worked in the Justice Department, and I knew he was right. Had been right. And not wrong. You didn't have to ever take anything back. And then suddenly, I don't know what that, it was after Watergate, wasn't it? It was after it.
After Nixon resigned.
Yeah, somebody said to me, do you know somebody who I could not lie to or did not, and said, do you actually know his name? And I said, no, I don't. And it occurred to me that was dumb. So Bob and I walked into the neighboring park one day, and we sat down, and we had a little chat, and I got his name. And we never used it, but at least I had it. And Catherine Graham, God rest her soul, never, used to come down 4 times a day in the city room and said, what does Deep Throat say today? But never, didn't ask his name. Kurt.
And we kept that secret for more than 30 years.
Yeah.
And who would? It's
I didn't tell my wife.
Yeah.
That is the secret.
Good decision.
Good.
But isn't it one of the Russian novelists who says that the only way 3 people can keep a secret is if 2 of them are dead. And we were all very much alive,
Yeah.
but it was in our interest to keep our word.
That's right.
And as a working reporter up to this day, it helps me immensely when I go talk to people and say, look, this is in confidence. I'm not going to say where it came from. They say, okay, there's a history of keeping your word on this. This is a serious commitment.
And Catherine Graham, with her life on the line, a certain business life on the line, didn't ask. I'm appalled by that today.
Was there a point in the Watergate investigation when you got scared?
Yeah.
Tell us.
More or less constantly.
Well, there was a moment when he was particularly afraid.
Yeah, well, it was in the spring of '73 when Mark felt in laying out, and I think this was somewhat my paranoia, but it was his literal language, and he said the stakes are so high that people's lives could be in danger, and that there's electronic surveillance going on. The entire intelligence community is involved in shenanigans, as we later learned about, which he had some glimpse of his position in the FBI.
Well,
and
that's
this is
when you came out.
yes,
Yeah,
and this
tell
is
him.
when tell him what happened. You're asleep.
Sound asleep, 3 o'clock in the damn morning. And Woodward calls and says, we've got to see you now. And so I say, all right. And they came out. I had a little house in, what the hell's the name of it?
Wesley Heights.
Wesley
and
Heights, yeah. And
we knock on the door, Carl and I, and he comes out in his jammies,
and we stand in line.
which weren't very pretty, by the way.
And we stand out in the cold, and they tell me this story, and I couldn't believe it. I mean, it was so hard to believe.
And
we set out because I thought, Woodward said the house is tapped, obviously, and which we later tested. All our houses were tested every few months, and they never were. as far as we knew.
And, we were also telling you what Mark Feld said, that this story is unspooling, that everyone's involved, that Nixon's involved. It's got a forward momentum to it, which you can't really comprehend. And I remember laying that out to you, and you're kind of listening, and kind of, should I, call the guys in white jackets, because we're telling you this on your lawn, and it was cold.
3 o'clock in the morning.
3 o'clock in the morning.
Nothing unusual about that.
And in the movie version of this, Jason Robards, who plays Ben in the movie version, at the end says, now, okay guys, got a lot of work to do, go home and take a bath and then get back on the beat, and not much is at stake. Just the First Amendment and the future of the country. Now, that's not what Ben said. It's true. That's the Hollywood version. That's what the people who made the movie wanted it to be. But it wasn't. And here is it. After all of this is told to Ben, he turned to us, and this is precisely what you said. What the hell do we do now?
You love that story, don't you?
Oh, no, but I love that story because you said exactly the right thing. We were going into totally uncharted territory. None of us, even you, had the experience dealing with something like this. Instead of kind of, taking your stick out and kind of showing you're the boss and in charge, you honestly said, I don't know what to do. And what we did is we kept reporting, we met, we maintained our whole approach, multiple sources. Let's make sure this is a time when I was going over to the Nixon White House and pleading with them, saying, we know that this is going to reach many new levels, there are more tentacles of Watergate, and we want to talk to President Nixon about this. And there now are tapes of Nixon and Ziegler and Haldeman talking about my request to talk to Nixon, which was not necessarily well received.
But you've got to also remember, newspapers is a very competitive business, and there was no other newspaper that had this story, that wrote this story. Finally, a couple of months, about 6 weeks in, Seymour Hersh, who was working for the
New York Times.
And then someone other.
L.A. Times.
The L.A. Times had one, but there was just not a mass acceptance by the rest of the press.
It helped you, didn't it, when Walter Cronkite did the story?
The Great White Father. I did. You won't believe it, but that when he went on television with a two-night segment, he said, I can't get it all in one night. The first
15 minutes, and then one was 7 or 8 minutes.
Yeah, well, they were both supposed to be 15, but after it hit the fan, who the hell was head of CBS?
Frank Stanton. Frank Stanton.
They got a lot of pressure
And
from
William
the
Paley.
White House.
No,
William
it's
Paley.
not.
Big Bill Paley.
So they cut the second down to 6 minutes or 7 minutes, but that was enough. And Cronkite, he really was the great white father at that time. If Walter Cronkite said it, it was.
But there's no reason people would. What those segments did is Walter Cronkite said, and this was right before the '72 election,
Yeah,
maybe 10
October.
days before. Said it looks like Nixon's going to be reelected, but there are these questions about Watergate, and then the stories were all about our reporting.
Yeah.
and said the Washington Post says this, and the White House denies it, and the Washington Post has, says there are checks and there's money and there's a secret fund and there's sabotage and espionage and so forth. And for CBS and Walter Cronkite to do that was quite gutsy.
Now, Bob, you've got to tell people the story of your coffee machine conversation with Carl, which is about at this time, isn't
Yes,
it?
that's right.
This is something you did not write about in All the President's Men. Please tell us the story.
This is the fall of '72 when we had written the story about...
I'm not making gestures at you.
I know.
There was
Hit it with your stick.
yeah, not too hard.
This is the fall of '72 when we'd written a lot of these stories, and one of them was that John Mitchell, the former Attorney General, had been in charge of this secret fund that had financed Watergate and lots of the other undercover activities. And you had said in the meeting before publishing the story that, we better be real careful. We're accusing the former chief law enforcement officer of the United States of being a crook. And as we were going through this, Carl and I, in one of our morning sessions in the Post, little corner room where they had the worst cup of coffee you could buy for 15 cents. And Carl puts his money in and turns around and said to me, this guy, meaning Nixon, is going to be impeached. And I just thought for a moment and I said, I think you're right, but we can never use that word around this newsroom. And we can never think in those terms because we have to stick to the story, which is what we attempted to do. But that was Carl having, connecting the dots and realizing that you can't have somebody like John Mitchell as Attorney General, campaign manager, so close to Nixon, so deeply involved in this, and that it's not going to spread to Nixon.
Okay, you have the election in November 1972. The president is overwhelmingly reelected. Do things start to dry up for you? What happens in the story?
At one point, I think Ben gave an interview saying he wanted to hold our heads in a bucket of water. They did
dry up.
They did dry up, and we didn't have stories for a long time, and it was agony.
That's just a loose bug.
Yeah.
I can't hit it with this.
Yes, that's right. That was it. Let me tell this story because Ben has mentioned Katharine Graham, who was the publisher and owner and Ben's boss. During that period after the election, our stories dried up, sources dried up, but at that moment, and Ben can, I think, verify this, most people in the Post newsroom didn't believe what we'd written. Don't you think, Ben? They did not think we were right.
Well, it was the group that didn't.
Yeah, particularly on the national staff.
Yeah.
And the we learned later.
The national staff is the couple.
A-team.
The A-team. You strive to get on the national staff.
Yeah,
and
we
here
were
these
on
two
the
kids
C-team.
who were in boot camp.
And we later learned one of the secret Nixon strategies was to challenge the FCC TV licenses that the Post Company owned. So the stock was in the toilet. Our journalistic reputation was at least on the rim of the toilet. And Katharine Graham asked me for lunch. And so this is January '73. And I remember going up to lunch with Howard Simons, who was your managing editor, and sat down, and she started asking me questions about Watergate. And it blew my mind how much she knew about the details. Yeah. She was real, she knew Henry Kissinger well. I mean, at one point she even said, I read something about Watergate in the Chicago Tribune, And I remember thinking, what's she reading the damn Chicago Tribune for? No one in Chicago does. Cheap shot, I apologize. It's even more the case now. But she was scooping up all the information. And later have described this management style she had of mind on, hands off. She didn't tell you how to edit, didn't tell me how to report, or Carl how to report, but she was intellectually engaged. Her mind was totally active on it. And it was comforting, and it also meant there was
Motivating,
more pressure.
tremendously motivating. You wouldn't want to let someone like that down.
Exactly. And so at the end of the lunch, she asks the killer CEO question, which is, when are we going to find out the whole truth about Watergate? And I said, Carl and Ben and I all felt, because it's a criminal conspiracy, everything is compartmentalized, because they're paying people for silence, because we go visit people and they slam doors in our face, they're frightened, that the answer, when are we going to find out the whole truth of Watergate, is never. And I remember looking across that lunch table, and she had this pained, wounded look on her face, and she said, never? Don't tell me never. I left the lunch a motivated employee. But what she said was, and this is so important, was not a threat, but it was a statement of purpose. What she said was, use all the resources that you and Carl have, all the resources of this newspaper. We have an obligation to get to the bottom of this story, not just because we're out on a limb on it, but because of the implications go beyond journalism. If, as we believe this is true and it is proven, something is going on that is a 10 on the Richter scale. And, you see it from your chair, from my chair, a reporter having the publisher say, look, go after it. Use everything. We are going to get to the bottom of this is incredibly liberating. And someday we're going to put a plaque in the lobby of the Washington Post, and we're going to bolt it to the wall so no one can take it down. And it's simply going to be, quote mark, never, don't tell me never, end quote. Yeah. Katharine Graham, January 1973.